Welcome all to this Policy and Practice seminar. My name is Alan Rennick. I'm Professor of Democratic Politics here at UCL, and I shall be chairing you for this evening. Welcome especially to those of you for whom this is your first Policy and Practice seminar. This is the flagship public events series for the UCL Department of Political Science, in which we welcome experts and practitioners, thinkers and doers to explore some of the most important policy questions and political questions that are facing us today before a lively audience of people like you. So students from UCL and elsewhere. Often we have some sixth formers, don't see anyone, I think, in the room today, maybe a few, as well as academics and interested members of the public and policymakers and many, many other people. So welcome to you all. It's really fantastic to see such a full room of people this evening. Our events take place every Thursday evening during term at this time in this room. So I very much hope that we'll see you at future events over the coming weeks as well. Given that this is our first event of the year, I just wanted to say big thanks to the many people who are involved in running these seminars. They don't happen without a great deal of effort behind the scenes. So many thanks especially to Fergus and Aparna, who are the academic coordinators for these events, to Eleanor, who does all the hard work of actually making the events happen and run so smoothly, to Lisette, who is somewhere lurking at the back, making sure we are running smoothly on the night, to our AV team who bring these events to a wider audience as well. So thank you to all of you. Now, normally we have speakers, as I said, from both the worlds of academia and from practitioners, politicians and policymakers and so on. But we thought that given that this is the season opener for the new academic year, we would showcase a fantastic bunch of academics and the expertise that they bring to bear on a really important question of our time, to do with how healthy is democracy today. What are the problems facing democracy, and what potentially can we do about those problems? So, as you can see, we have an amazing panel of amazing speakers. I'll go in order from my left, which is not the same order as on my sheet of paper, so let's see how we go here. So immediately on my left, we have Dr. Michal Ovadek, who is lecturer, assistant professor in European Institutions Politics and Policy in the UCL Department of Political Science. His research focuses on European integration, judicial politics, and Central and Eastern Europe, and he particularly looks at the impact of legal institutions, especially courts, on politics and society. Then we have Dr. Malu Gatto, who is Associate Professor of Latin American Politics at the Institute of the Americas here at UCL. Her work explores questions about political behavior, representation, policymaking, and gender and politics, with a particular regional focus on Latin America, especially Brazil. Her book, Resistance to Gender Quotas in Latin America, was published by Oxford University Press earlier this year. Dr. Katerina Laval is, here we go, Assistant Professor in Comparative Politics at the University of Reading. Her research focuses on the politics of emotions and political behaviour during times of political polarisation. She has published on topics including partisan echo chambers, negative campaigning, and public attitudes towards immigration. Professor Brian Klaas is Professor of Global Politics at UCL and also a contributing writer at The Atlantic magazine. He is an expert on democracy, authoritarianism, American politics, political violence, elections, and the nature of power. His books include Corruptible, Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us, and The Despot's Accomplice, How the West is Aiding and Abetting the Decline of Democracy. And last but very much not least is Professor Tarun Kaitan, who is the Chair of Public Law at the LSE Law School. His primary research interests include comparative constitutional law, legal theory, and discrimination law. And he's recently co-edited a couple of books that are very relevant to tonight's theme. One called The Entrenchment of Democracy, the comparative constitutional law of elections, parties, and voting, and another called Constitutional Resilience in South Asia. So, we have a fantastic amount of expertise on the panel. We will start off by having a bit of a discussion among ourselves for the first part of the session, and then we will open to questions from you. So please do be thinking about what questions you would like to put to the panel. And before we begin, let me just note that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded. So if you ask a question, or if otherwise you speak, you will be heard on the recording, which you might just like to bear in mind. And afterwards, the recording will go on the department's website, YouTube channel, and on its podcast. So let us begin. And given that we have such breadth of expertise from all around the world, I thought it would be useful if we began by doing a little bit of a survey of the state of democracy in the various parts of the world that you are all expert on. So could I ask each of you in turn, how would you characterize the state of democracy in your particular area of specialism, your particular region or country? What are the principal reasons for concern, as well as maybe even for optimism? Let's start in the south rather than in the north, as we do far too often. Tarun, do you want to tell us about India?
Of course, thank you, Alan.
And if you want just to pick up a microphone.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So Prime Minister Modi is in his third term of premiership. He was first elected in 2014, and his 3 terms, well, he's just about over a year in his third term. His 3 terms have been quite different. I have a paper looking quite closely at his very first term from 2014 to 2019 called Killing a Constitution with 1,000 Cuts. I'll briefly summarize why the terms have been different and maybe say a few things about why India might be different from some of the other countries that you might hear about. So, there's democratic backsliding happening across the world, but it's happening in some similar ways, in some different ways. I think it's about 5 or 6 years now that the VDEM index has classified India as an electoral autocracy. So very much towards the end of the first term of Prime Minister Modi. He came into power in 2014 with a total popular vote of 32% for his party, but in a multi-party contest with first past the post that translated into a near majority, and with coalition he got a full majority. In 2019, the vote share increased to about 37-38%, and that translated into a full majority for his own party. In the last year's election, 2024, the projections were completely wild in a completely captured media ecosystem, and his party surprisingly fell short, to the surprise of his own party as well as the political opposition. There are some people who say that a fair election might well have seen the opposition actually winning the contest. So that should give you a sense of how much entrenchment of power has happened. The main mode of analysis that I've employed in my work is to distinguish between the legitimate policy choices that an elected government whose ideology I dislike should be permitted to undertake, from a government that is trying to rig the game, rig the electoral game. And this is really hard in a context where there haven't been any formal constitutional amendments, certainly not of the sort that we saw in Hungary, for example, right? So all of this has happened, as it were, incrementally, bit by bit, hence the metaphor of killing the Constitution with 1,000 cuts, but systemically. And the 3 mechanisms that have been assaulted have been direct electoral accountability to the people through both demographic changes, or trying to effect demographic changes, through campaign finance laws, which, I don't have the time to go into the detail, but they've been really outrageous. laws enacted, struck down by the Supreme Court about 8 or 9 years after their operation, in which time the ruling party amassed a war chest of fortune. In the second count, his government has systematically undermined every institutional check, horizontal checks, from courts to the political opposition to guarantor institutions like electoral commissions, federalism, and again, this has happened mostly in the gray zone of law as well as in the zone of constitutional conventions, norms of political civility that most previous politicians, for whatever reason, seemed to follow, and he has just completely disregarded them. And finally, civil society and media and universities. This has been particularly bad, quite brutal, often violent, frequently critics have been murdered with plausible deniability, certainly arrested. There have been activists who have been in prison for years now, 7 years, and counting, for Umar Khalid, who's been in prison without any charge sheet. And the judiciary obviously has a lot to answer for this. So that's the broad overview. In the second term, some of this incrementalism gave way to much more full frontal, loud authoritarianism, which is also met with a much greater civil society mobilization. So the flip side of doing things in your face, like the amendment to the citizenship law that gave all non-Muslim refugees from neighboring countries a fast track to citizenship, excluding Muslims, right? So that saw protests in the tens of thousands across the cities in the country, with people chanting the preamble of the Constitution, which became a symbol of popular resistance, cut short with brute force and the COVID pandemic. And last year's election has been a surprise. The government seems to have lost its swagger, but not its ferocity. But it's still early days. It remains to be seen. I think I'll stop there.
That's fantastic, Taryn. Thank you so much. And you've given us a really helpful framework, actually, for thinking about various aspects of democratic weakening in terms of those three elements around electoral accountability, around institutional checks and balances, and around the media and civil society. So it'll be interesting for us to see whether we see similar patterns or different patterns taking place in other parts of the world. Let's stay in the south for a little bit longer and go to Malu and the situation in Brazil. Should be on.
Yes, thank you. Well, great. So before I start talking about, Brazil, let me just give you perhaps a little bit of a timeline on things, very short timeline. But Brazil, last year, Brazil celebrated 35 years of its new constitution, since redemocratization. And a year from now, we're going to be holding our next presidential elections in the first weekend of October 2026. And so this is a good time for us to be thinking about the state of democracy in Brazil. From 1994 until about 2010, I would say that the elections in Brazil were very stable. Although Brazil has a highly fragmented multi-party system, you had elections that were basically at the presidential level competing between the center-left and the center-right. 2013, you start having very large street protests in Brazil. The 2014 elections were already tense because the candidate who lost the election did question electoral results. That starts, Dilma Rousseff won by a very narrow margin, which, that also starts impeachment proceedings, leading to Dilma's impeachment in 2016. Fast forward to 2018, which is when Jair Bolsonaro wins the election, really changing the dynamics of political dynamics in Brazil, changing the ways in which competition takes place. Because what that did was it completely killed the center-right and to a greater extent also the center in Brazil. So, the question that Alan asked was essentially, how is democracy holding up? Where should we be optimistic? And what are we pessimistic about. And so let me focus on that, because I'm sure that many of you have heard about the Bolsonaro years and what Bolsonaro did during COVID and in lots of other ways. Bolsonaro did lose his re-election bid in 2022. That also did not go without challenge. On January 8th, there was an invasion of public buildings. But I would say that, and the electoral period did have quite a lot of violence, which was something that we hadn't seen before. I would say that in general, democracy is holding up, perhaps not in the ways that that they did until the 2010 elections. Largely, when we're thinking about electoral accountability, elections are still free and fair in Brazil. There have been continuous efforts to undermine trust in elections, and particularly trust in the electronic voting in Brazil. There have also been efforts to keep people from voting. I think that one thing that, the compulsory voting in Brazil and also the habit of voting that has come with it has in a way kept people engaged with elections, although turnout has decreased. I think that what we also see with the recent trial and sentencing of Bolsonaro is that the judiciary is punishing political wrongdoing, and that, coup attempts, were punished, essentially. And Bolsonaro he cannot run for office. He's ineligible to run for office in the next presidential election. That, however, has put the courts in a difficult position in the sense that, given polarization, high degrees of polarization in the country, the levels of trust in the judiciary are low for a quite large segment of the population, and there are questions about the politicization of courts. Since the impeachment of Dilma and Bolsonaro's time in office, I think that the other thing to say here is that there has been a break in the ways in which the balance of power between the executive and the legislature have previously worked, and the legislature now has a lot more power than before, which also has raised concerns about balance of power, particularly in the context of also a contested judiciary. I think that what that has led, for many reasons that I can talk more about, the rise of the far right has also led to an institutionalization of the far right to different degrees in the country. Before in Brazil, we used to talk about a highly fragmented party system with one institutionalized party, which was the PT. And I would claim that the last municipal elections, we've seen the institutionalization of far right wing parties in Brazil, in part due to the ways in which public campaign finance help these parties, elect more people, because they are distributed based on the number of seats that parties are able to elect to Congress. I would finish with a comment on civil society, because I think that basically ended up structuring, coincidentally, my comments in very much the same ways. I think that the greater the rise of Bolsonaro to power has led to a greater engagement of civil society in a way that has also transformed itself. I mean, since redemocratization, and perhaps because of the military dictatorship in Brazil, progressive civil society has always been quite skeptical of formal politics. But what has happened is that we've been seeing civil society become more engaged with formal politics, including in the training of candidates to run for office, which is something that we haven't seen before. And, since Bolsonaro's rise to office, we've seen more than 50 organizations like that spread out across the country to train women, indigenous people, LGBTQI+ people, and Afro-Brazilians to run for office, which is an institutional an innovation in Brazil. But what we've also seen is an emergence and organizing of right-wing civil society, which is not something that we've seen. And a civil society that's also becoming more involved in formal politics as well, and that it's also doing its own work to, also train people to run for office. What am I optimistic about? I think that elections, to a large extent, continue to take place in a free and fair way, and people are rising to the challenge in a way to keep elections free and fair and to contest far right-wing politics. What I'm pessimistic about, well, lots of things. I'm pessimistic about a divided society, right, and high levels of effective polarization. That also is not affecting everyone equally, and I can talk more about that. In a recent work, I've shown how election-driven conflicts are breaking up families, but particularly those from for LGBT people in Brazil. I think that I'm also pessimistic about the next electoral, the next elections, in the sense that I see many possible names in the far right, particularly because of this institutionalization of the far right, but not a lot of viable names in the center or the left. No real substitute for Lula. No clarity what the left is going to do in the next electoral cycle. I do see some levels of optimism in the in the progressive sort of civil society camp, but I also think that one thing that I've seen once Lula got elected is that the funding for these civil society organizations disappeared in a way that's quite similar. And so it disappeared with many organizations ceasing to exist and others being sort of like leaders of these organizations have then moved into government, which is something that we also saw in the transition to democracy, and also with, Lula being elected or the PT being elected in earlier years, that people from civil society organizations kind of, those were weakened and people moved into the government, which raises questions about, whether civil society will still be on the ground if the right wins office in the next election. But I'll end here because I think that there's a lot to talk about already.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you so much, Malu. Let us now move a bit further north, but stay in the Americas, and go to Brian.
Great. I have the the pleasure of explaining Donald Trump to you, which is always a bit of a challenge. So I think the big question that we're asking as political scientists that study the United States is whether the United States is still a democracy. There's a phrase in political science literature of competitive authoritarianism, which for those who are unfamiliar with this, is a bit of a clunky term. It's basically, you've got the trappings of democratic institutions, but it's not a fair playing field, right? It's not a level playing field. The state engages in manipulations and so on, and the sort of constraint that exists in democratic institutions is being eroded. And I think the state of that debate is questions of, have we reached that point yet, or are we going to reach that point before the end of the second Trump term? Now, the first thing to say is that U.S. democracy was weak before Donald Trump in certain ways that were structurally problematic. There was widespread gerrymandering. The role of money in politics was grotesque. Voter suppression was rife. There were lots of problems, right? What Donald Trump has done is expose those problems and take a wrecking ball to the institutions and exploit the weaknesses in those institutions. And he's done that with alarming speed in the second term, much more than the first, right? A lot of the pushback that happened in the first term is not happening in the second term, and a lot of Trump's attempts to destroy democracy in the second term are far more aggressive and far more rapid than they were in the first term. We heard about the coup being punished in Brazil. Let's start with the first thing that Donald Trump did when he took office in January of this year. He pardoned the January 6th insurrectionists who took over the Capitol in an attempt to seize power for Trump after he lost a democratic election, right? And spreading the conspiracy theory that he secretly won somehow. He did not. And so this aspect, now it continues to plague politics in the United States. A couple weeks ago, Donald Trump announced that he would hold full military honors for Ashley Babbitt, the woman who was killed in the January 6th insurrection. She was killed because she was trying to break through a window to storm the Congress to potentially murder members of the U.S. Congress, right? This is why she was shot. So to hold full military honors tells you a little bit about what Trump's message he's sending about the sort of state of democracy. Now, how is this actually operating in practice? There's a series of things that are happening that I'm very, very worried about. One of them is the erosion of checks and balances. We always hear about the U.S. Constitution as this model of checks and balances. The Founding Fathers assumed that the other branches of government would want to constrain the executive, that they would want to grab power for themselves too. So the reason the checks and balances work is because Congress wants power as does the president, and they fight, right? Or the Supreme Court wants to constrain these bodies. That's not happening, right? Congress is willingly giving up power. The Republican-controlled Congress is willingly giving up power and allowing Trump to basically cancel funding, change laws that he shouldn't be able to change, and they're going along with this. The Supreme Court has an extraordinarily expansive view of presidential power. In 2024, they ruled that Trump or any U.S. president can, I'm not making this up, commit any crimes as long as they do so in an official capacity, right? That's the effective ruling from 2024, that as long as it's done in the business of the White House, it's okay if it's illegal. I mean, that's not great for democracy, right? On top of that, you have the erosion of trust in institutions. Electoral dynamics are very toxic right now. Trump has lied repeatedly about how elections are rigged, which they're not in the US, other than through things like gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is, it's where you basically voters pick politicians, where politicians pick their voters rather than voters picking their politicians. So you're drawing lines to maximize your ability to win. This usually happens every 10 years through the census. The Republicans are trying to change this in a variety of states mid-decade, before the midterms next year, to change the districts to their advantage. And this brings me to the second part that's a problem. In addition to the lack of constraints, it's that when authoritarian death spirals happen, they happen because initially there's an asymmetric, one party is an authoritarian party, the other party abides by the rules. Eventually that stops happening because the losing party that wants to abide by rules realizes if it keeps playing by the rules, it will never have power. And I think that's what's happening to the Democratic Party right now. I think a lot of the Democratic base is starting to think, okay, if we get into power, we need to have purges of our own. We need to have vengeance. In California, there is talk of re-gerrymandering the state. It was a hallmark of depoliticized gerrymandering through citizen commissions and so on. And now they're trying to overtly re-gerrymander the state to counteract what's happening in Texas, right? So as sort of playing hardball, if you're going to manipulate the rules, we'll manipulate them right back. What that does is a race to the bottom, right? It may be a strategy that constrains some of the authoritarian movements of the Republican Party, but it also means that increasingly it becomes part of both parties' politics to break standard practices of democratic norms and procedures. Now, the final thing I want to talk about on the domestic front, before I briefly say something on international aspects of U.S. democracy, when you think about what's going on in the United States, the thing that really scares me is the information flows, because there is an essential component of democracy that performance and scandal has to be tied to electoral results, right? In other words, if you don't deliver for people and you engage in corruption and scandals, if that doesn't have an electoral cost, at some point democracy is meaningless. Donald Trump has been at a 40% approval rating pretty much every day since 2016. Nothing he has done has really changed that. The lowest he has been is around 34% when Charlottesville happened and he said there's very fine people in the neo-Nazi movement. He's had various points where he's at 44%. Nothing changes anything, right? And at some point, you sort of look fondly on the Liz Truss days of Britain because she screwed up and she had a 9% approval rating, right? Like, at least democracy functions such that she was kicked out of office. Trump can do anything and have 40% approval. That is really, really bad for democracy, and that's partly because of the information flows and how broken they are, the sort of propaganda machine that excuses almost anything Donald Trump does, the information flows on social media, and the lack of clarity around basic functions of reality, where if I talk to somebody in the MAGA base, instantly the conversation breaks down because they don't believe Trump lost in 2020, right? And then you can't really go beyond that because they think Biden was an illegitimate president. So that aspect is really, really corrosive. And it leads to what's happening now, which is crazy violations of norms that last in the media cycle for less than a day, right? So, 2 days ago, Donald Trump said to the troops, or maybe it was yesterday even, Donald Trump said to the troops, we want you to use U.S. cities as practice for the military. That will not be in the news in 2 days, I guarantee you, right? There's a government shutdown happening right now. That crowds out some of these other things. You probably haven't heard of the fact that the Daily Caller, one of the top MAGA publications, had an editorial 4 days ago that literally called for blood on the streets and said that there should be political violence against Democrats. Charlie Kirk was killed 2.5 weeks ago, right? Like, these things are happening at an extremely fast pace, and the consequences of them are fleeting. And that's where democratic breakdown happens. So I'm very, very pessimistic about the United States. My one area of optimism is not the Supreme Court being the white knight that constrains Trump's power. I don't think that's going to happen. It's that the clock might run out, right? So Trump is unpopular enough that the Republicans might lose the midterms. And if the Democrats genuinely get one of the houses of Congress, are able to take power that way, there's a lot of things they can start to do to slow down the process. So one of the things that I think is the smartest strategy for protecting democracy in the United States is to, Steve Bannon talks about flooding the zone with information to try to get away with stuff. It's flooding the courts with lawsuits, because that slows down legislation. And I think it's really the only thing that's going to happen positively, because the structural dynamics are extremely, extremely bad in the United States right now. Sorry to be a downer. There's not a lot to look forward to in US politics at the moment.
Sobering. Thank you very much. Let us move across the Atlantic, and Katerina and Michael have the hard task of covering half of Europe. So, Katerina, the western half, first of all.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So, all of Western Europe in 3 minutes, that's fine. So I would say, first of all, just to sort of change the mood a little bit, Western Europe, I think if we kind of look at different types of democracy indexes worldwide, Western European countries still score consistently in like the top 25%. All right. So I would say Western European countries broadly we can think of as democratic societies where really basic democratic principles like free and fair elections, freedom of speech, kind of independent courts, that's still functioning. Okay. So just to kind of put that into context, like within the panel. But of course, there are reasons for concern. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. And I want to talk about those a bit more. So I think one thing, if we think about different Western European countries, I would say one trend that is really related to challenges to democracy across these is the rise of the far right and the rise of extremist parties. So something that has really changed over the last 20 to 30 years, and changed in a way that I think we absolutely didn't think was possible 15 years ago. I come from Germany originally. If you told someone there at a far-right party that makes Holocaust excuses would score 20% in a national election, you would have been like, absolutely not, that's not possible. We've got these really strong democratic norms against parties like this, and yet this is what's happening, right? And I think we also see this across other places where the far right historically hasn't been so popular until recently, like Portugal, for instance, right? And now increasingly the far right is governing in places like Italy, Austria, the Netherlands. In northern European countries, they've been part of government coalitions repeatedly, in Norway, for instance. So we're seeing a completely new wave of not just the far right being successful in public discourse, but really becoming embedded in parliamentary institutions and increasingly being part of government as well. And of course, this is really relevant here in the UK. I think Reform UK is like the #1 thing that Keir Starmer tried to talk about and sort of show people that Labour is doing something about this at the recent party conference. And why do I think, what does research say about like the relationship between this rise of the far right or the radical right and democracy? Well, I think it's challenging for multiple reasons. One of them is polarization increases, okay? As soon as we've got kind of a far right or radical right party entering the party system and being successful in that way, what happens is that the ideological distance, how much we disagree on stuff in parliament, vastly increases all of a sudden. And it's not just ideological, it's not just what's the best immigration policy, what's the best welfare policy, where this ideological space increases and conflict increases. It's also on this affective level. And that's something that a lot of my research is about. Malu mentioned this concept as well, affective polarization. Brian talked about it too. It's the idea that we no longer disagree politely on a policy, we disagree over who we like and who we are. So politics becomes increasingly personal, like an us versus them conflict that feels really existential. And this is, I think, where things get problematic from a democratic perspective. So it's no longer about polite disagreement, it's about me feeling threatened if you win an election. Because I think if you win, you're going to make changes that go to the core of who I am and what kind of life I want, right? And this type of polarization, effective polarization, has been associated with lots of attitudes at the mass level that we think are really problematic for democratic functioning, right? An unwillingness to talk to the other side, an unwillingness to work and collaborate with people across political divides, but also a greater willingness to let democratic norms slide, basically. So as long as it's good for my side, as long as they win, I'm happy to, like, you know, close my eyes to whatever undemocratic stuff my side is doing. And very problematically, it's also been associated with an increased sort of acceptance of political violence. And I think there's still quite a lot of, it's a complex research field in the sense that I don't think we want to say there's a causal relationship between effective polarization and political violence. But I think there's something to be said that if politics gets heated, this us versus them conflict that feels existential, it can create the kind of permissive environment for these attitudes to start existing. And just to give you some examples, in the Netherlands, we've got elections coming up. Just last month in September, there was a really big radical right protest that escalated into violence. Police and journalists were severely hurt at this. The offices of another party, D66, were damaged, and this caused a huge scandal and lots of worries about potentially more violence as part of this campaign. I think political violence is something we've also sort of talked about a lot in this country. Just last month, the offices of a Labour MP were damaged, where fire was set to that building. There's lots of evidence that especially women MPs, especially MPs from minority ethnic backgrounds, are really concerned over their personal safety and well-being, and that those concerns have increased in recent years. Some of my own work is on local politics and diversity in local politics, and one of the number one reasons that people cite for wanting to leave are those kind of concerns. So even though sort of the basic things in democracy are still working in Western European countries, I think we've got to be really careful about these subtler processes starting to change, all right? If the heat turns up, there are lots of other undesirable things that start happening that can really undermine the quality of democracy as we go along, where certain groups start retreating from the democratic process because they no longer feel safe or welcome in it. And if we think that democracy is meant to be everyone having a fair chance of feeling represented and being part of that process, that's very bad news.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much, Katerina. And it's really important that you and Malu have both brought out the fact that democratic troubles affect different people to different degrees and in different ways. It's not, we're not just talking about something happening at the macro level. We're also talking about something that affects people in their own lives and affects different groups within society in quite different ways, introducing extra inequalities. Michal, finally, you're covering Central and Eastern Europe.
Yes, thank you, Alan. So I think a lot's been already said, and I think one thing I would emphasize is that I think there's a lot of similarities between all these different contexts, despite the fact that they are often, thousands of miles apart. I think this sort of authoritarian playbook that we see play out in many of these contexts is often, replicated. And there's also authoritarian learning across the different leaders who are leading the charge against democracy across the world. And so in Central and Eastern Europe, I guess I'll go back to your question about what is, optimism and pessimism. It is mostly pessimism, I'm afraid. On the kind of more recent news, there's a Czech election coming up tomorrow and on Saturday. Recently there was an election in Moldova outside the EU. And so maybe to diversify a little bit, I can touch upon two things that haven't been mentioned yet, which are particularly relevant in the European context, which is the role of the EU in safeguarding democracy, such as it is. Is there a role for the EU? And the second thing is Russia and Russian interference in elections which is global, but it is more concentrated, sort of in some sort of concentric circles, right? Like the closer you are to Russia, the more exposed you are to Russian efforts to undermine democracy, and so Moldova really is one of those frontline states, which is sort of where sort of Russia sees that this is all to play for, and citizens are essentially deciding on whether they will be in the sort of Russian disinformation sphere of influence or whether they will belong to the EU. And there's a concrete offer right from the EU. Moldova is technically at least on the path to membership of the EU. And so that election, so on the optimism side, that election was won by Maya Sandu's party, who's been in power for the last couple of years, which is sort of fervently pro-EU and pro-democracy. But I think we should also say that that's an election that was marked by the banning of parties, which have been supported by Russian money. So like, it's precisely, I think, what Brian touched upon this already, this kind of race to the bottom of like, well, if there is anti-democratic influence, how do you counter it? How do you counter it in a democratic way? And I think that's something that hasn't really been figured out. And it's something that several countries across the world really struggle with. And so in the Moldovan scenario, right, we can say, yes, it makes sense to ban a party if it's supported with money that isn't sort of legitimately, transparently shown, and it's also sort of done in a way which there is sort of no legitimate purpose to the party other than to sort of undermine the election, and there's a foreign actor doing that on purpose. But then, what is the appropriate measure? What is the appropriate response? Because of course, banning parties is usually not a good sign of a sort of healthy democracy. Another example of how difficult it is to counter these things is Poland. Poland had a presidential election this year. So many of the countries in the region, just some background context, are semi-presidentialist. So they have both a president and a prime minister. Usually the prime minister is the stronger element in the government. And that's also the case in Poland. But Poland had the presidential election this year, which was won once again by the Law and Justice candidate, which is the party that was responsible for democratic backsliding between 2015 and 2023. And so, despite the fact that the sort of, we can say, liberal opposition, which is now in government, has been trying to sort of at least promise the reconstruction of democratic institutions in Poland, that has shown to be extremely difficult. There's problems both in how do you do it. There's problems with the fact that your base might want to punish the opponents. So you have to resist that at the same time, and still, clearly the commitment of the electorate is not such that they would see the Law and Justice Party, which was doing the backsliding before, as somehow that the candidate they're going to put forward in the presidential election, that they would be ineligible to lead the country, right? So backsliding itself seems like, or weakening of democracy doesn't seem to be a disqualifying feature of politics in Central and Eastern Europe. It was something that was mentioned already. So I just want to emphasize that we see this across different contexts. But the country that's actually backsliding the fastest in Europe and one of the fastest in the world is Slovakia, and it's the country that since 2023 as well has had seen the return of Robert Fico and his party. This is also an example where we have political violence. So there was an assassination attempt a year and something ago against him. The person who was doing it was obviously very, very polarized, just trying to bring in all the themes that we have seen. And yeah, Central and Eastern Europe is an incredibly polarized region. It's, I think, potentially some of these countries are the most polarized in Europe. Information flows are really bad. So I think there's a lot of similarities and a lot of reasons for concern, not just individually, but globally. And I wonder if there's a sort of aggregate effect of all these things, right? Like if all these things are happening at the same time, maybe they share some of the causes, but does that also make it worse that backsliding is happening across the world?
Gosh, thank you, Michael. I was hoping that Moldova might give us some context for optimism this evening, but you've pointed out why even there are causes for concern. We could talk about these matters all evening. Sadly, we're not going to have time for that. But let me put one question to you before we go to your questions, which is, what's driving all of this? So Katerina in particular and Brian talked about polarization and the rise of the far right. But that leads, of course, to the question of, well, what's driving these things? So several of you talked about the media context, information flows. Michal, you talked there about foreign interference, particularly from Russia. We often also hear people talking about the economy and both lack of economic growth since the financial crisis in 2008-ish, and also longer-term kind of growth of wealth concentration, and the fact that many people don't experience increasing well-being over time. Are there other factors as well? Are some of these factors more important than others? What should we say about what's driving these problems? Katerina, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, lots of different things, obviously. I think with the far right in Western Europe, for instance, there was always like this discussion in the past, is it like economic grievances or culture? By now, people have landed on it's a complex mix, basically, yeah? So it's very often people who are frustrated by their living situation, their economic circumstances, but it's also deep-seated concerns over changes in culture. And I think that's partially why these conflicts heat up so much. It's because they're not just about a simple welfare policy that can be changed. It's really deep-seated conversations about who we are as a society, and that's why they become, sort of tend to get this effective dimension rather than the sort of policy disagreement dimension. Why does it sort of then lead to this polarization? Well, there's quite a bit of research on what happens when political competition gets reorganized in that way. And one of the things that we've seen increase is what we call partisan social sorting. So in the past, within one party, you might have people from lots of different walks of life. And so maybe what was easier then was sort of making those bridges across, right? So, you know, in the US, for instance, Democrats and Republicans, they still share like other things, other attributes that they care about. But as we start to sort socially, these types of supporters tend to have the same kind of jobs, the same kinds of cultural tastes, the same kinds of opinions, and all sorts of other things that are not related to politics. There's no longer this common ground that we can find to bridge those political divides. And I think that's really acute as well when we think about the far right and other political parties. There's a lot of stereotyping that goes on as well, and some research shows that if we try to debunk that, we can move people away a bit and not lower the heat on that. Some of my own work shows that when you try and just bring people together to chat, they realize the other side is not as bad, actually. And if you can have a more kind of civilized, normal conversation with them, that really reduces polarization. So I think something that we really need to, that's a problem, but also a potential solution, is breaking down these echo chambers and encouraging more cross-divide dialogue, encounters, conversations to move politics away from this very heated, hostile exchange to something where it's more about policy and how we can actually constructively solve problems in society.
Thank you. Taryn, you had your hand up.
Thanks very much. As a lawyer, it's beyond my pay grade to talk about the socioeconomic underlying causes, although I would recommend Karen Stenner's 2006 book, The Authoritarian Dynamic. I found it incredibly insightful and extremely illuminating for what's going on today. And she's a political psychologist who's explained authoritarianism much before in the good old days of George Bush and President Obama. But as a lawyer, I'm going to talk about some institutional causes which are more proximate. There are lots of design skeptics within my field who think design is neither here nor there. There are also, I think, extremely naive people who think design can solve all our problems. I'm one of those who thinks that design is not irrelevant. Good design can slow down bad things, and bad design can hasten them. But even the best design cannot stop an overwhelming political force. So just a couple of things on institutional design. Instead of just looking at bad examples, what is the example of a country where this is not going on, certainly not to the same extent, despite it sharing so much of the cultural sort of essence of Euro-American sensibilities, and that's Australia, right? And I don't think it's a coincidence that in Australia the centre is holding, that there isn't the degree of political polarization. And you would say, I would say this, right? But I think it's down to design. Both compulsory vote and ranked choice voting, which is a centripetal electoral system, simply, far-right parties are like Marmite. Enough people in here know this horrible thing called Marmite that some people claim to love, right? Like Marmite, far-right parties are very few people's second choice, right? You love them or you hate them. And without second choice votes, these parties end up getting nowhere, right? So there is a one Australia party or one nation party, right? It gets a few seats to rant in the proportionate Senate. And I think that's important because you want to keep the crazies in the system. They're better in the system than outside the system, but far away from executive power. Right? In Europe, and this is, by the way, a progressive blind spot as well, right? Even today in this country and in Canada, progressives keep asking for PR, despite seeing what PR has done in country after country in Europe, where sooner or later, the lowest hanging fruit under PR is to polarize, get that 10%, 15% vote, get that 10%, 15% seats, and come to hold the balance of power once in a while. Exhibit A, Israel, right? And the consequences can be enormous. The second thing I don't think works is the progressive love for direct democracy and deliberative democracy, right? Thinking that process will solve this problem, that the more power we give the people, this is not a problem of disempowerment, even if it's expressed in those terms, because I don't think the ordinary individual has ever had as much power as she has today. This is an affective problem of belonging, and I think unless progressives come up with an answer to the belonging question, they are going to go from election to election, keeping their fingers crossed and hoping for the best, right? And I think a progressive answer to belonging cannot be identity-based because it's not internally inclusive and externally distinctive, right? That is the progressive problem. You want an answer to belonging that includes everybody inside, whatever their race, religion, ethnicity, etc. And you also need to say what distinguishes an English person from a German or the French or the South African, right? And that's hard. I've been exploring this idea of behavior-based belonging, drawing on ideas of conscription, talking about care-based conscription is sort of marrying some feminist ethics on care with the idea of conscription as sacrificial service to belong as something that progressives could try. But anyway, I'm not saying that is the answer, right? But without progress, if they don't enter the battlefield, and when belonging is the question to answer, you can be a Kamala Harris and try to dodge the question, say, no, let's talk about bread and butter issues. You can do a Hillary Clinton and make fun of them, basket of deplorables. Or you can be a Keir Starmer who until last week was like, I will out Farage, right? None of these are winning strategies. They have to come up with an ideological alternative to the belonging question. And in the meantime, I think Europe needs to move away from PR and get to something like a majoritarian ranked choice voting system because the center still exists and it might actually thrive.
We can disagree about some of that afterwards. I'm very conscious of time. Do you mind if I come to others in the next round? So let us go to questions from you, and I will take questions in groups of 3. So who would like to ask a question? Do you want to raise some hands? And, oh yes, we need to give a microphone to Aparna, who will come. Let's go right to the back of the room, and person just in front of the door there, right at the back. Yes.
Hi. Oh, it doesn't matter. I can project.
No, it's on.
It's on?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Hi, my name's Ash. Thank you so much for your thoughts initially. They were amazing. My question is about the role that private companies play in democracy. Coming from a financial background and seeing how different companies can heavily influence the flows of information. What do you guys think the impact of organizations like Google, Microsoft, etc., who are the people who control information and the people who show your news in the morning. It's not Sky News anymore, it's them. What role do they play in furthering like the right-wing arm of different countries? Because you can see with like reform, it wasn't really a thing like 2 years ago, and now I've seen it on the news like every single day, and then they've just like skyrocketed in popularity since then.
Fantastic question. Thank you very much. I think I saw another hand quite nearby. Yes, just a gentleman also at the back.
Hi. Hi, my question is on the comment made by Professor Ketan some time back on the question of belonging. What do you all think on the question that the flaw of a progressive party system to reach out to the people? Professor Catherine mentioned about the when she went into the workshop to train the people, they think that the other side is not too bad. So I'm talking about what do you think of civic education and the education of literacy in reaching out to the people and thinking about that, the question where they belong to that progressive party system or not.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And gentleman just in front of you, Aparna, with hand up. Yes.
I'm Robert Hazel, professor in the Pol Sci department. My question follows what Michael was saying about authoritarian politicians learning from each other. And my question is how? There's a huge literature on democracy, both academic, going back decades, and from think tanks and civil society organizations and the like. Is there now an emerging literature which provides a playbook for authoritarian leaders? And is it academic literature? Is it grey literature? Is it completely underground? Samizdat kind of literature? Answers, please.
Great. 3 fantastic questions. Thank you so much. Brian, do you want to pick up the one on private companies?
Yeah, that would be great. So this is a huge problem in the United States right now. Donald Trump could not be successful if the private sector did not back him effectively. And what you see is a rapid change in January 2025 from people who vowed basically to never touch Trumpism again after January 6th, turning around and giving $1 million to his inauguration, going to the White House, and so on. And of course, this affects things like the media, where you have, X with Elon Musk directly involved in the government, the first half trillionaire as of yesterday, I gather. The sale to TikTok, again, people who have donated to Donald Trump. The Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, who has warmed to Trump significantly. I used to write for the Washington Post, and I would have been fired, I suspect, under the current sort of ownership and so on. So, I think this is the kind of stuff where those dynamics are facilitating this in a huge way. The money is going behind Trumpism because they understand that he is wielding power in a way that punishes those who cross him, right? I mean, Republicans in the past used to say they're sort of for small government. And in a very short period of time, they are arguing in favor of the government directly picking winners and losers, right? Carving out tariffs for specific friends of Trump versus punishing those. After Charlie Kirk was killed, they said that, they had a podcast that J.D. Vance hosted saying we are going to use state authority to go after things like the Gates Foundation, right? Because they believe that it's funding left-wing terrorists, which is obviously not true. So there's things like this which are happening. My surprise with this, and I think it's where one of the things that has come up a few times, but not maybe as explicitly, there has to be a democratic opposition that meets the moment. And what I've been really surprised at and saddened with in the United States is I do not think the Democratic Party under its current leadership understands the scale of the threat to democracy. And if they did, I think one of the most effective things they could do was to rally the money that is in the blue states, which is a lot of money, to try to impose costs on companies that go along with Trumpism, right? And you have test cases of this. So like Jimmy Kimmel getting taken off the air for relatively minor comments about Charlie Kirk. That's the kind of stuff where if you start to impose costs on ABC Disney for doing that, or CBS News, which basically paid they would not call it a bribe, but they effectively settled a court case that had no merit to directly pay Donald Trump, right? And like everybody agreed there was no merit in this case. It was a frivolous lawsuit, but they figured it's better to just pay than not pay. So there's all sorts of things like this that if there was a rally of financial interests against Trumpism and in favor of democracy, it could be extremely influential. Nobody is leading the charge. And so instead what you have is sort of inaction and then a bunch of businesses who say, well, we'd rather be exempted from the tariffs, so let's say nice things about Donald Trump. it's alarming the degree to which private interests are willing to violate basic principles of civil society and democracy in order to earn slightly larger margins on their profits. And I think that's basically what we're seeing in the US right now.
Thank you. Malu, do you want to pick up the question on civic education, political literacy, that kind of thing?
I think that's a great question. A few things there. I think it depends on the timing when it comes to civic education, in the sense that if you have a far-right government in office, oftentimes education is a key agenda item, right? And so when you're thinking about Brazil, I mean, this is core to the disagreement between the far right and, the left and other parties. And so civic education that is meant to counter the far right or to counter polarization wouldn't be viable to be implementable in that context, right? Simply because this is key. I mean, one of the main things, for example, one of the key talking points of Bolsonaro during his first run for office was the idea that schools were brainwashing children, and particularly with respect to gender equality and sexual education, right? And so you can see how that is embedded into some of the discussions that we're talking about already. I also wanted to make the point that, politics is a learned process, and so a lot of the political socialization takes place within the households. And what we're seeing right now is how children are also being socialized within this context of polarization, and we're already seeing, anecdotal evidence. I mean, it's harder to understand what's going on with children because we largely cannot survey children for ethical, reasons. But we are seeing anecdotal evidence of lots of cases in school of violence, taking place because of political reasons and children disagreements. And the other thing here to also raise, I think, is how, and I think it gets to the point of the other question, not as much in terms of, companies, but in terms of communication, right? I mean, one thing that we've seen with social media is also how, there's a lot less control about content, right? And one thing that we've been seeing is targeted content for children also, in terms of that reinforces some political ideas that are quite extreme. And this has caught quite a lot of attention and debate more recently in Brazil as well. And so the point is there could potentially be a place for civic education, but I think that within the context of polarization, but especially within a context of where the far right is already, in government, that could potentially not make, possible for those things to actually be viable. I mean, we're seeing that in the United States a lot, even like ongoing things, right? Like things that we would think of as, established educational principles being taken away, and a lot of move backwards in that sense.
Yeah, it's really interesting that some of the remedies that are available maybe in the early stages of democratic backsliding cease to be available once you've gone too far down that route. Thank you. Michal, how do authoritarians learn from each other?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't have a sort of concrete answer. I don't think we have historical records yet of like how exactly they speak to each other and learn from each other, like in the documented. But I think it's quite obvious. So like there is quite a bit of analysis among academics of what are the steps that typically take place in a country that's democratically backsliding or turning to authoritarianism, right? So there's quite a lot of analyses. I'm not going to sort of pick any specific study here to mention, but there have been quite a few over the last, I think, 10 years. And it's often the same stuff, right? It's targeting the courts, it's targeting the media. Electoral meddling typically comes only at the end. Here, the U.S. is a bit of an there's a difference in the U.S. because the gerrymandering, as you already said, was such an established institution before that. But I think what is really important there is more. So I think authoritarians see what happens if you adopt a certain measure in one country and see the reaction to it, right? So this is really useful. So if you have multiple authoritarians around the world, right? If you're, for example, Robert Fico in Slovakia, you look at Viktor Orban, what he did 5 years ago with NGOs, and you can see the extent of the pushback that he got, and it probably wasn't that much. You can see the reaction of the financial markets. That's something that's kind of underappreciated. I think also goes a little bit to the first question. Financial markets have played some constraining role in the Slovak case, but we can argue about the extent to which. So I think it really depends. So I think it's maybe less about yes, there are new ideas coming from authoritarians all the time, like new creative measures of backsliding through the back door as much as possible, like out of the public sight, so that you don't generate too much salience and too much pushback with whatever you're doing, right? The more you can keep it under the wraps, the better. But I think what is really important there is that there is now that gumption, many leaders who wouldn't dare to do something 10 years ago feel that they can do it now. So there's this breakdown in norms, I would say. And sometimes it's illegal, oftentimes it's just norms that they're being violated, right? So I think NGOs is a good example. It's one that it's kind of a measure that you can literally see in almost all of these contexts. There's a systematic crackdown on the space that civil society has, to be critical of the government, to be critical of individual public figures, and so on. And if you look at Hungary, you look at Slovakia, you could look at Russia, you literally see copy-pasting of almost the same type of law in all of these places, and in many other places in the world as well. And so you can truly see how the kind of ideas travel across authoritarian regimes.
Thank you. We can just fit in one further round of questions if we have very quick questions and very, very, very quick answers, okay? So let's go at the front this time. So we have a question from the person in the black T-shirt here. Yes.
To kind of link to what you were saying on political education, what impact do you think social media and its echo chambers are having on democratic health? And how do you think we can combat this, considering it's something that can impact society on such a large scale, especially those who are totally unaware of its existence?
Fantastic question, thank you. And then do you want to move the microphone just over to the person one row behind you? Yeah.
Well, thank you all for the great session, the great panelists. We've learned a lot, I think, of the night. There was one main theme that was really interesting to me through all the talks that we heard tonight, which was the institutionalization of the far right, which was very interesting to me personally. I had a question specific for Dr. Brian, which has to do with politics in the US. I was curious to know, sir, as a Democrat that is personally, what is your current message to the Democratic Party right now? Because I feel like ever 2016, the majority of this party has been simply denying the fact that we've entered a new age of politics, where misinformation and straight-out lies are passed as factual evidence, where people who have no authority on certain issues claim themselves to be experts, and expert opinion is set aside. And if I can just finish on this, it appears that the Democrats are still hoping that 300 pages policy books will help them fix this system. And it's very sad if the only, it appears because the only organized front within the Democratic Party appears to be the far left, figures such as AOC and Sanders, and it's very sad if these are the only individuals which will be sold as the solution to the problem. I don't think they're the solution personally. I think they will only prolong the many problems that we have in the States, and I was hoping to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much, and just in front of you here.
Thank you. I just wanted to touch on what I think you said earlier about how in Europe we kind of have that top 25% of what we call or what we think are democratic things like free and fair elections and freedom of speech, and how the smaller, less important or less thought about things are kind of disassembling slowly. And if you can kind of compare that to the Trump term 1 and term 2, and how in the first term we still had those like free and fair elections and the big aspects of democracy, but the slow things were kind of disassembling slowly, and then how we see it in the second term now. And like you said, the example of Jimmy Kimmel, for example, that kind of disintegrating, and if Europe, how long Europe has if we kind of, already have the small things disintegrating and maybe in the future, the bigger things.
Great, thank you so much. You have literally 1 minute each. I will stop you if you go over. Brian and Katerina, you had questions directed at you, so I'll start with the two of you, and then I'll go to the others. So Brian.
Okay, 1 minute on the strategy to resist Trump. Basically, there's two things I would say. One is wield power aggressively. The Democrats have some ways to slow down some of these things, and they need to rise to the challenge of doing that. And then the second thing, which is true of the universal literature on democratic backsliding, find a big tent, because the only way you defeat authoritarian movements is by getting everybody who disagrees on other policies but agrees on democracy to get together. And if Trump has a 40% approval rating, that means that he doesn't have 60%, right? So if they can't win the election that way, then they need to find a way to build a big tent and say, this is an existential election. We have to come together, even if we disagree on taxes and abortion and all these other things, to save democracy.
55 seconds, very, very good. Katerina, how long does Europe have left?
All right. I'll try and end on an optimistic note, which is, I want to give you just one really quick example. Germany, the last turnout was over 80%, okay? So it's not just that these parties are doing well and no one cares. People care, and people come and turn out sometimes to prevent it. And I think that's really important. I think parties who care about democracy need to engage in persuasion efforts to convey to people what's under threat and that it's worth turning up and talking to people across divides to prevent that. And I think if we can do that, I hope we will continue to live in democratic societies in Europe. But that's what needs to happen.
Great, thank you. Taran?
Well, the far right has thrown open the Overton window, which is the window of things a society finds sensible, plausible, doable, etc., right? But the window has just moved far, far to the right. The progressives have no big ideas. They're only offering tweaks to the system. And until the progressives can fundamentally reimagine, put their gaze beyond neoliberalism and liberal constitutionalism, take the question of both belonging and equality seriously, I think they're doomed. I'm a long-term optimist, but a short-term extreme pessimist. I think we are up for a big explosion in the world of the sorts of the 20th century, and hopefully after that, if we survive, we'll come to our senses.
Malu?
I'll try to end on a little bit of a note of optimism, trying to partly answer your question. I mean, I think that there's lots of research that's not very optimistic, really, about what to do about echo chambers and social media and whether what works against misinformation or not. But what I did want to say is that I think that part of why the far right has been successful in many contexts is also because they've been able to communicate really well and sort of like hack social media and like communications in different ways that the left hasn't necessarily been able to. And so it's been able to like really communicate with the population in a different way. And one of the things that I've been seeing more recently in Brazil is that the left seems to have like woken up to that and like learned how to use social media in a way that really works to communicate across the board with lots of people. I think that means lots of things in terms of like potentially like, what does it mean that the government is now using memes to communicate, with the population, which raises questions. But I do think that there is a certain level of optimism here with regards to the next campaigns and what that means potentially.
And Michal.
Okay, I'll try to end on a note of optimism, even though I think I'm more of a pessimist. I think so. I get to be a pessimist as an academic. I think that's different, but I think the public needs to be optimistic. And so I think so. The thing that I want to say is it's still all to play for in many places, and so the democratic opposition or the government should not give in before the fight is over. And the fight is in many places just started. And so the Czech election tomorrow, the Moldovan election, which was just won by the pro-democratic bloc, the Slovak party system is still all to play for. In Hungary, Viktor Orban might lose power. These are all signs that it's not, it's not been, authoritarianism is not entrenched in many places, and it probably can be reversed despite the difficulty of the task.
I wish we could go on, but I'm afraid we can't. Let me just quickly mention next week's Policy and Practice seminar, which will be on EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, DEI, if you're used to American English. So there seems to be a backlash going on against EDI, just as against democracy. Why is that happening? What are the implications and what can be done in response? That will take place next Thursday on the 9th of October at the same time in the same same room, and you can sign up on the UCL Department of Political Science website in order to book your place. So I hope to see lots of you there. But very importantly, what a fantastic panel and what an amazing discussion. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.